I think ethics is always there. It's just not always a very thoughtful or reflective ethics.
You're listening to Smart Thinking, a podcast from WSP. I'm Matthew Marson, taking you on a journey into smart buildings. In this podcast, we're talking about how ethics are more important than ever in a world of machines making decisions. Joining me in the studio is Conor Clarke, innovation and technology professional who helps his clients to design and build technology solutions to solve problems across the organisation. Conor holds philosophy and ethics degrees from the University of Cambridge and King's College London. Welcome, Conor, and jumping in straight to our first question, what is a smart building and why should we care?
So I would imagine different people have different answers to these questions and different professionals care about different things. But for me, as somebody who's interested mostly in the philosophy and ethics angle, I think what a smart building is fundamentally is a building that can make decisions, that can make choices about the environment. And those choices might have ethical dimensions to them.
Could you give us a couple of examples?
So you know very well that my favorite example of smart building technology is the democratic thermostat. Mm-hmm. So one sort of pre-existing puzzle in political philosophy is the idea of the persistent minority in democratic politics. So if we endorse democracy as a ethical decision-making process for communities, for populations, but we also have certain sort of subgroups within that population who are consistently finding themselves in the minority in the course of the democratic decision-making process, what do we think our ethical obligations are to those persistent minorities, given that they will very rarely, if ever, get their way? This is the kind of ethical question which it would be very easy to overlook in the design of a feature such as a democratic thermostat if you didn't have your ethical cap on when you were trying to make these decisions, when you were designing the mechanisms that allow these buildings to make choices. But there's a very rich tradition of ethical thought that could be used to inform those decision-making processes, your design of these control systems, which will potentially make your building more ethical.
So you're saying that when we are making systems that have to make some kind of a decision, we have to be thinking about those that might be worst off from the decision that the machine makes?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's already comparable ideas or responsibilities at play in the built environment. So you will know from your training that architects have a certain kind of legal or fiduciary responsibility to design buildings that are going to behave in predictable ways. I think there's a similar obligation for the people who are designing the decision-making procedures for buildings that do more than just exist as part of the built environment and provide space for you to sort of exist and work in. I think that there's a comparable responsibility to design robust buildings that are robust, not just structurally, but also ethically. And I think the designers undertake a certain responsibility when they decide they want to do that, when they decide they want to make a smart building.
That's incredibly interesting. I'm certainly seeing movements in the market with a growing interest in ethical artificial intelligence.
Yes.
And how to kind of build in the right thing to do, which is incredibly difficult to define. So would you think it's fair to say that ethics are more important now than ever?
I think so. And to substantiate my point, I'm going to quote Spider-Man. So with great power comes great responsibility is a fantastic pop cultural slogan of ethics, but it's also, I think, a fairly substantive statement and probably true. So as we gain more capabilities as human beings, as we advance our technology, as we gain the technological know-how that allows us to do new things, we have to also consider how those new things are going to impact our ethical frameworks, what relationship they're going to have with the things that we value, what the impacts or consequences or fundamental character of those decisions are going to be. And aside from anything else, the potential to use these new technologies usually means we're creating new and interesting ways, potentially disastrous ways for things to go wrong. You might have seen in the news recently on the BBC, I know there was an article about the police using big data algorithms. I'm not sure if it crosses the threshold into AI, but certainly smart technology to identify within a crowd suspects for further examination by trained police officers. Now, obviously, this set everyone's sort of Orwellian bells ringing. People were very concerned about computers profiling suspects or making decisions on criminality or the sort of suspiciousness of individuals in a crowd. And I think this is a prime example where just the ability to do something that we couldn't do before, train an automatic system to look at a large population of people and pick out people who resemble known criminals or people who look suspicious or hit certain markers, raises a whole set of ethical questions that maybe were always implicit in ethics, but which never really came up before because we just didn't have the capabilities that were relevant to make them worth considering.
And it's almost as if the pursuit of productivity allows us to kind of get away with things that we might not consider as ethical in an analog way. So if you were to take an understanding of how people like their temperatures, for instance, or even the sort of work setting that they might use within the office, it might lead you to deduce certain indicators about how well they perform or particular behavioural characteristics that they have. And in doing so, you could lead somebody to make hiring decisions on the basis of, say, something simple like, do you prefer it warm or cold in the office? And I think where it's a bit of a slippery slope.
I think it's a very good point. Anybody who's been paying attention to what's been going on at Amazon recently knows, and indeed anybody who's been paying attention to industry in general since about the 1920s will know that Taylorism, this drive to treat people more like elements of a machine rather than as sort of human beings with needs, desires, and limitations and stresses all of their own, will be aware that it's very easy when you start reducing every dimension of your organization to data points. It's very easy to lose sight of what those data points represent. And that leads to things like, Amazon workers who are carrying out picking tasks in their warehouses being afraid to take toilet breaks because they're afraid that it will impact the data which their supervisors are using to track their performance and draw conclusions about how good they are at their job. So I think, the capabilities can often obscure the rights and wrongs of what it is that we're trying to do because people get so caught up in the enthusiasm of the productivity gains or of the potential that new technology represents. It's very easily done, and very easily done especially in an environment that tends to emphasize compliance and legalistic considerations as opposed to more fundamental deep dives, if you want, consideration of the underlying ethical issues. I think that's something I think compliance and ethics are different things, and they're very often sort of conflated and drawn together. So that's something to watch out for as well.
In retail, we're seeing there's a kind of pushback for the use of technology in automated tools to, say, offer you a particular offer. And even when it becomes overly personalised to you, there's almost like it's gone a little bit too creepy. But these are really important metrics for investment decisions in the marketing campaigns of these retailers. So how do we find the right line between doing what's right for our business versus what feels right to the population?
I think what you might be alluding to there is the much publicised case of the lady who didn't realise she was pregnant, but then started to receive recommendations for nappies and formula and things like that.
That is one example, that I've seen.
And I think that that is creepy, obviously, and that puts people on edge for perfectly understandable reasons. I think that the balance that you alluded to that we need to strike comes from not cutting human beings out of the process. If you're considering doing something that becomes fully automated, then you have to have a robust, considered human approach to designing that process, which takes into account all the relevant factors. You can't just optimize based on data. You can't just optimize for productivity because you will inevitably encounter, at least in my opinion, unexpected side effects of doing so. Secondly, if you can keep humans involved in the process, I think, and it's desirable to do so, I think that's definitely a beneficial thing. Machines are nowhere near the ability to replace a human being's considered ethical judgment. So if you can get somebody involved in the decision-making process who is capable of wearing that ethics hat, who can bring that kind of judgment to bear on the situation, I think that's a very useful safeguard or check and balance to have placed on this technology, just to make sure it's sort of serving the kind of values and ends that we do think are important, that we do find valuable. But also, even, and this is a broader point, it doesn't necessarily apply just to smart buildings, but I think it does apply to smart buildings as well. Getting people who have thought deeply about ethical issues, who have training in the traditions of ethical thought that we have access to, but tend not to utilize, I think it's very important to getting to the right answer on all of these sorts of questions, because you don't have to start from scratch. There's thousands of years of tradition of ethical thought and ethical discussion and rational, logical attempts to sort of get to the truth, the heart of the matter of what the right thing to do is. So why not use that resource?
Would you go as far as saying that any machine that is capable of making decisions should be required to have a human supervisor?
I think that's pretty plausible. I think if they don't have a human supervisor, someone needs to have been involved in the design of that system who at least is capable of bringing this lens to the question. I think it's reckless to design systems like this where you're simply optimizing for performance metrics, because I think that's courting disaster. I think if not involved in the actual process, it's very desirable to involve someone like an ethicist or someone who's engaged with these issues in a substantive way in either the design or the actual process that's considered here.
What would your top tips be to somebody who wanted to design an ethical smart building?
Hire an ethicist.
And any kind of practical steps beyond just hiring an ethicist?
Yeah, so hire an ethicist. They don't have to steer the conversation. They don't have to make sort of big deterministic decisions about what it is that you do, but involve them in the design process. It's very much de rigueur these days to have co-creation processes, to bring in cross-functional expertise, to enhance the quality of the designs that you're producing. You would never dream of designing a customer-facing product these days without somehow getting the voice of the customer involved in that, whether that's a data-driven exercise or more of a qualitative exercise. There is absolutely no reason why the ethicist point of view shouldn't also be an input into that cross-functional collaborative design process.
A big thank you to Conor Clarke, innovation and technology professional, for joining me in the studio. Join us in our next episode, where we'll be turning the tables on myself with a guest host. Tom Smith joins us, who is the Global Director of Property and Buildings, as he quizzes me on the drivers for strategic value within a smart building.
If something in this episode has piqued your interest, then have a chat with us. Email smart@wsp.com.
You're listening to Smart Thinking, a podcast from WSP.
I'm Matthew Marson, and thanks for listening.